The office hummed with the usual rhythm of keyboards clicking, phones ringing, and the occasional murmur of conversations that never rose above a whisper. Among the busy workers, a tall, well-dressed man strode confidently through the aisles, his polished shoes clicking against the tiled floor. This was Richard Harrington, the manager who had earned a reputation for being strict, demanding, and at times outright cruel. He wasn't just a boss, he was asterisk the boss asterisk, and he loved making sure everyone knew it. Today was no different. Richard's sharp eyes scanned the office floor like a hawk surveying its prey. Employees instinctively ducked their heads, pretending to be deeply engrossed in their work, hoping to avoid his gaze. But Richard's smirk widened when his eyes landed on one person in particular. Across the room, Naomi Bennett sat at her desk, her posture poised yet relaxed, as she reviewed the latest project files. Naomi was relatively new to the company, having joined just a few months ago. She was sharp, professional, and carried herself with quiet confidence. Her presence alone unsettled Richard. Naomi was unlike most of the other employees who scurried around trying to please him. She didn't shrink under his scrutiny or scramble to seek his approval. But that wasn't the only reason Richard had taken notice of her. Naomi was black, and while the office prided itself on being inclusive, Richard often harbored thinly veiled prejudices that surfaced in the way he treated certain employees. Naomi's intelligence and composure, combined with her calm refusal to play into his power games, only made her a bigger target in his eyes. As Richard approached her desk, he plastered on his trademark condescending smile. "Naomi," he said, his voice dripping with fake politeness, "how's that report coming along? I trust it's finally up to the standards we expect around here." Naomi looked up from her work, her expression calm and professional. "Good morning, Mr. Harrington," she replied, her tone measured. "The report is coming along well. I've double-checked the data, and I'll have it ready before the deadline." Richard raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "Before the deadline, huh? Let's hope it's not like the last one. What did you call it? A rough draft? I'd hate for the higher-ups to think we're hiring people who can't handle simple tasks." A few nearby colleagues paused briefly, their eyes darting toward the exchange before quickly looking away. The tension was palpable. Naomi, however, didn't flinch. She met Richard's gaze with quiet determination, her hands resting calmly on her desk. "I appreciate your feedback, Mr. Harrington," she said, her voice steady. "I'll make sure the final version exceeds expectations." Richard smirked, clearly pleased with himself. "See that you do," he said before turning on his heel and walking away, leaving an air of smug superiority in his wake. As the day progressed, Richard's comments grew increasingly pointed, and it wasn't just Naomi who bore the brunt of his behavior. His overbearing presence loomed over the office like a dark cloud. But Naomi, to everyone's surprise, remained unshaken. She continued her work with the same quiet focus, refusing to let Richard's words throw her off balance. Later that afternoon, Richard called an impromptu meeting, gathering the entire team into the conference room. He made a grand show of reviewing the current projects, throwing subtle jabs at anyone who didn't meet his impossibly high standards. When it was Naomi's turn to present her progress, he leaned back in his chair with a smug grin, clearly anticipating an opportunity to undermine her in front of the team. Naomi stood confidently, her presentation polished and thorough. She walked the team through her findings, addressing potential challenges and offering solutions. Her professionalism was undeniable, but Richard wasn't about to let her shine. He said, tapping his pen against the table once she finished. "That's decent, but next time, try to dig a little deeper. We need more than just the basics if we're going to impress the board. And maybe consider running your ideas by me first. We wouldn't want any oversights." The subtle dig hung in the air like an invisible weight. Naomi's expression remained neutral, but there was a flicker in her eyes, a sharp glint that didn't go unnoticed by a few of her colleagues. "Thank you for your input, Mr. Harrington," Naomi replied evenly. "I'll take it into consideration." The meeting wrapped up shortly after, and as the team dispersed, whispers filled the air. Some colleagues murmured their sympathy for Naomi, while others exchanged knowing looks. Richard, meanwhile, basked in what he believed to be another victory. But what Richard didn't know was that Naomi wasn't just an ordinary employee. Beneath her calm exterior lay determination that would soon shake the foundation of the office and Richard's career. The real turning point came the next day when Naomi walked into the office with a sleek black folder in hand. She moved with purpose, her usual calm demeanor now carrying an unspoken intensity. As she approached Richard's desk, her colleagues exchanged puzzled glances. "Mr. Harrington," Naomi said, her voice firm but polite, "I'd like to discuss something important with you." Richard barely glanced up from his computer, his smirk firmly in place. "Oh, Naomi," he said dismissively, "is this about another project update? Let me guess. You've found yet another way to overcomplicate things." Naomi didn't respond right away. Instead, she placed the folder on his desk with deliberate precision. "Actually," she said, her tone steady, "it's something far more significant." Richard frowned, finally looking up. His eyes flicked to the folder, then back to Naomi. There was something in her gaze that made his confidence falter ever so slightly. "What's this?" he asked, reaching for the folder. Naomi didn't answer immediately. She stepped back, crossing her arms as she watched him open it. Richard's smirk faded as he flipped through the contents. His face paled, his hands freezing mid-turn as realization dawned on him. The folder wasn't about any project. It was about him. The room seemed to grow quieter, the usual office hum fading into the background as Richard sat there, staring at the evidence laid out before him. "Care to explain this, Mr. Harrington?" Naomi asked, her voice carrying a calm authority that sent a chill down his spine. Richard opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. For the first time in his career, he was at a loss for words. And that's when it hit him. He wasn't just dealing with an employee anymore. Naomi Bennett was much more than she seemed, and his world was about to come crashing down. Richard's hands trembled slightly as he held the folder, flipping through page after page of damning evidence. The words jumped out at him like sharp edges. Asterisk workplace harassment, asterisk asterisk toxic environment, asterisk asterisk demeaning behavior, asterisk each line detailed incidents that he had dismissed as inconsequential, behaviors he had long convinced himself were just part of being a good leader. But now, seeing them spelled out in black and white, he realized how utterly exposed he was. The atmosphere in the office seemed to shift as Naomi stood silently, her calm presence radiating authority. Richard's usual confidence was slipping through his fingers like sand, and for the first time in a long time, he felt truly vulnerable. He forced a chuckle, an attempt to regain control of the situation. "Well, Naomi," he began, his voice strained, "this seems thorough, but I'm not sure what you're trying to accomplish here. These claims..." He gestured vaguely at the papers. "They're exaggerated at best. Misunderstandings happen all the time in high-pressure environments like ours. I'm sure we can sort this out without involving unnecessary parties." Naomi didn't flinch. Her expression remained steady, her gaze unwavering. "I don't think these are misunderstandings, Mr. Harrington," she said evenly. "The details speak for themselves. Multiple employees have shared consistent accounts of your conduct, and as a representative of a higher authority, it's my responsibility to address it." Richard froze. A higher authority. What did she mean by that? A pit began to form in his stomach as he realized he had underestimated Naomi from the start. She wasn't just a new employee trying to prove herself. She was someone with a purpose far beyond this office. "Higher authority," Richard echoed, his voice tinged with nervous laughter. "I don't understand. Are you trying to suggest that?" Naomi leaned forward slightly, her calm demeanor taking on an edge that made Richard's words falter. "Let me make something clear, Mr. Harrington," she said. "I'm not here to play games. My presence in this company isn't a coincidence. My role is to evaluate workplace conditions and ensure compliance with federal standards. What I've found here is troubling, to say the least." Her words hit him like a blow to the chest. Naomi wasn't just an employee, she was a government inspector. The realization sent a cold wave of panic through Richard. but he tried to mask it with feigned composure. "Well," he said, clearing his throat, "I can assure you that any concerns you have can be addressed internally. There's no need for formal action. This is a small misunderstanding." Naomi raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "A misunderstanding?" she repeated. "Mr. Harrington, do you believe the experiences of your team members are insignificant? Dismissing these concerns is exactly the kind of behavior that led to this investigation in the first place." Richard opened his mouth to respond, but he was interrupted by a knock at the door. One of his assistants, visibly uneasy, stepped inside. "Mr. Harrington," she said softly, "there's someone on the phone for you. They said it's urgent." Richard seized the opportunity to escape the tension in the room, standing abruptly. "Excuse me for a moment," he muttered, walking out without waiting for a response. As he disappeared down the hallway, Naomi let out a quiet sigh and glanced around the office. The employees nearby quickly averted their gazes, pretending they hadn't been listening. But Naomi knew better. She could feel the unspoken relief in the room, the quiet gratitude of people who had endured Richard's behavior for far too long. When Richard returned a few minutes later, his face was pale, and his usual air of superiority had all but vanished. He avoided Naomi's gaze as he sat back down, his movements stiff and uncertain. "I've taken a moment to reflect," he began, his voice quieter now. "Perhaps there's been some oversight on my part. If certain actions have been misinterpreted, I'm willing to address them." Naomi studied him carefully. She could see the cracks forming in his carefully constructed facade. But she wasn't about to let him off the hook. "Acknowledging the issue is a start," she said, "but actions speak louder than words. The culture in this office needs to change, and that starts with accountability." Richard's jaw tightened. He wanted to push back, to reclaim some semblance of control, but he knew he was cornered. Naomi wasn't just another employee he could intimidate or dismiss. She had the power to dismantle everything he had built, and she wasn't afraid to use it. As the day wore on, the tension in the office grew thicker. Richard kept to himself, his usual arrogance replaced by a nervous energy that didn't go unnoticed by his employees. Naomi, meanwhile, continued her work with quiet determination, her presence a reminder that change was inevitable. That evening, as the office emptied out and the hum of activity faded, Richard sat alone in his office, staring at the folder Naomi had left behind. The words on the pages felt like a weight pressing down on him, a constant reminder of his mistakes. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Naomi had made it clear that she wasn't here to simply observe. She was here to take action. And for the first time in his career, Richard found himself powerless to stop her. As the lights in the office dimmed and the building fell silent, Richard leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. How had things spiraled so far out of his control? What would happen next? He didn't have any answers, but one thing was certain. Naomi Bennett wasn't going anywhere, and neither was the storm she had brought with her. The next morning, the office buzzed with nervous energy. Word about Naomi's true role had spread quickly, whispered in the break room, and exchanged in hushed conversations over keyboards. People who once avoided eye contact with her now watched her closely, curiosity and hope mingling with apprehension. For years, many had silently endured Richard's domineering leadership, believing they had no choice. Now it felt like change was finally knocking on the door, though nobody knew what form it would take. Naomi sat at her desk, her posture as calm and composed as ever. She moved through her tasks with quiet efficiency, pausing occasionally to speak with team members. These conversations were never confrontational, but always purposeful, gently peeling back layers of resistance and uncovering the stories people had kept buried. For some, it was cathartic to share what they had been through. There was Brian, the quiet analyst who confessed in a low voice how Richard had mocked his ideas in front of the team. And Anita, the marketing lead who admitted she avoided speaking up in meetings for fear of being singled out. Each story added another piece to the puzzle, painting a clearer picture of the toxic environment that had flourished under Richard's watch. Meanwhile, Richard was a shadow of his former self. The slugger that once defined him had been replaced by a tense, almost jittery demeanor. He spent most of the day holed up in his office, emerging only when necessary and avoiding Naomi as much as possible. His attempts to maintain control felt forced, his interactions with the team tinged with an awkwardness that hadn't been there before. But while Richard's behavior had changed on the surface, Naomi wasn't fooled. She knew he was scrambling behind the scenes, trying to find a way out of the mess he'd created. Late that afternoon, as she reviewed her notes, she received an email from Richard's assistant asking her to meet him in his office. When she stepped inside, Richard was standing by the window, his back to her. The blinds were half closed, casting striped shadows across the room. He turned slowly, forcing a strained smile. "Naomi," he began, gesturing toward the chair in front of his desk. "Please have a seat." She remained standing. "What can I do for you, Mr. Harrington?" Richard hesitated, his carefully rehearsed words faltering under her steady gaze. Finally, he cleared his throat and sat down, motioning for her to do the same. "I wanted to talk to you about all of this," he said, waving a hand vaguely toward the stack of documents on his desk. "It's clear there have been some misunderstandings in the past, but I assure you, my intentions have always been in the best interest of the team." Naomi folded her arms, her expression neutral. "Misunderstandings don't cause a pattern of behavior, Mr. Harrington. And intentions don't negate impact. The experiences of your team speak for themselves." Richard's face tightened. "I think you're being a bit harsh," he said, his voice rising slightly. "Managing a team isn't easy, you know. Sometimes you have to make tough calls, push people out of their comfort zones. It's not personal, it's just business." Naomi's eyes narrowed. "Is that what you told yourself when you humiliated Brian in front of the team? Or when you made Anita feel like her voice didn't matter?" "Leadership isn't about dominance, Mr. Harrington. It's about creating an environment where people can thrive, not one where they fear speaking up." The room fell silent, the weight of her words hanging between them. Richard leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. For the first sign, he looked genuinely tired, as though the weight of his actions was finally starting to sink in. But Naomi wasn't convinced. She knew this wasn't just about Richard's behavior. It was about the culture he had allowed to fester. And she wasn't going to let him off the hook so easily. As the day drew to a close, Naomi continued to piece together her findings, weaving the individual stories into a cohesive narrative. The evidence was overwhelming, but she knew that real change would require more than just pointing out the problems. It would take accountability, systemic reform, and a commitment to doing better. Meanwhile, Richard's anxiety reached a breaking point. That evening, long after the office had emptied out, he paced his office, his mind racing with desperate thoughts. He knew his reputation was on the line, but more than that, he feared losing the power he had spent years building. As he stared out the window, the city lights twinkling in the distance, Richard made a decision. If he couldn't regain control through charm or persuasion, he would have to find another way. A way to discredit Naomi, to shift the narrative in his favor before it was too late. But what Richard didn't realize was that Naomi was always one step ahead. And as he plotted his next move, she was quietly preparing for the final phase of her investigation. The storm was far from over, and the battle for justice had only just begun. The air in the office was thick with unease the next morning. Conversations dropped to hushed whispers when Richard walked by, his face set in a tense, unreadable expression. He avoided eye contact with everyone, especially Naomi, who carried on as though nothing was amiss. She sat at her desk, her calm focus betraying none of the weight she carried. Behind closed doors, Richard was making his moves. He had spent the night combing through old emails, project reports, and even employee evaluations, searching for anything he could use to undermine Naomi's credibility. To him, this wasn't just a matter of survival, it was a battle for control. The thought of losing everything he had built, of being exposed as a fraud, gnawed at him like a constant ache. When lunchtime came, Naomi took the opportunity to step away from her desk and meet with a small group of employees in the conference room. These were the same colleagues who had bravely shared their experiences with her over the past week. Now they were coming together to discuss what was next. "Thank you all for being here," Naomi began, her voice steady but warm. I know this hasn't been easy, and I want you to know how much I appreciate your courage. Your stories matter, and they're making a difference." The group nodded, some looking visibly relieved to be in the company of others who had endured similar experiences. Anita spoke up, her voice hesitant but determined. "Do you really think anything will change?" he asked. "People like Richard. They always seem to get away with it." Naomi met her gaze, her expression firm. "Change doesn't happen overnight," she admitted. "But it starts with accountability, and that's what we're here to do. You're not alone in this, and neither am I." As the meeting continued, the group shared more details, connecting the dots between Richard's behavior and the broader impact it had on their work and well-being. Naomi took meticulous notes, her mind working through the next steps. Meanwhile, Richard was in his office, making calls to his contacts within the company. He spun a narrative of a disgruntled employee who was trying to tarnish his reputation, carefully planting seeds of doubt about Naomi's intentions. He knew he couldn't outright discredit her role as an inspector, but he hoped to paint her as overly aggressive or unfair in her evaluation. When the workday ended, Naomi stayed behind, reviewing her findings once more. She was meticulous, cross-referencing every piece of evidence to ensure it was airtight. The folder she had presented to Richard earlier was only the beginning. There was far more she hadn't yet revealed. As the office grew quiet, the tension between them reached a boiling point. Richard, unable to contain his frustration, walked into the open workspace where Naomi was still seated. The sight of her calm, unbothered demeanor sent a fresh wave of anger through him. "Naomi," he said, his tone sharp, but trying to maintain an air of professionalism. "A word." She looked up from her notes, her expression neutral. "Of course," she replied, closing her notebook and standing. He led her into his office, shutting the door behind them. The blinds were drawn, casting long shadows across the room. Richard stood behind his desk, his hands gripping the edges as he faced her. "I think we need to clear the air," he began, his voice tight. "This situation is getting out of hand. Whatever concerns you have, I'm sure we can address them, without blowing things out of proportion." Naomi tilted her head slightly, her eyes narrowing. "Blowing things out of proportion," she repeated. "Is that how you see this?" Richard let out a frustrated sigh. "Look, I'm not saying everything's been perfect. But do you really think dragging this company through the mud is the solution? You've seen how hard I work to keep things running smoothly. I'm not the villain you're making me out to be." Naomi took a step closer, her gaze unwavering. "This isn't about me making you out to be anything," she said. "It's about accountability. This team deserves better, and you know it. The question is, are you willing to face that, or are you going to keep deflecting?" For a moment, Richard said nothing, his jaw tightening as he weighed his response. The silence was heavy, charged with unspoken tension. Finally, he straightened, forcing a thin smile. "I see how it is," he said. "You've already made up your mind. Fine, do what you have to do, but don't think for a second that I'm just going to sit back and let you destroy my career." Naomi didn't flinch. She met his gaze head-on, her expression calm but resolute. "This isn't about destroying anyone, Richard. It's about doing what's right. If that's a problem for you, maybe it's time to ask yourself why." With that, she turned and walked out of the office, leaving Richard alone in the growing shadows. The door clicked shut behind her, the sound echoing in the quiet space. As Naomi gathered her things to leave for the night, her phone buzzed with a new message. It was from her supervisor at the Department of Labor, confirming a meeting with senior management scheduled for the next morning. The timing couldn't have been more perfect. Back in his office, Richard sat down heavily, his mind racing with desperate plans to turn the tide. But deep down, a gnawing fear told him that the walls he had built to protect himself were starting to crumble. The stage was set, and the final act was about to begin. As the sun rose the next morning, the office seemed unusually still. A heavy anticipation hum in the air, though most employees couldn't pinpoint why. Naomi arrived early, her expression calm, but with an unmistakable focus. Today wasn't just another day at work. it was a turning point. Meanwhile, Richard sat in his car in the parking lot, gripping the steering wheel tightly. His hands trembled slightly as he thought about the meeting with senior management. Despite his outward arrogance, doubt had begun to creep into his mind. He had spent hours preparing his defense, spinning a narrative that painted Naomi as overzealous. But deep down, he knew the truth was slipping out of his control. At exactly 9 a.m., senior management gathered in the large conference room, their faces set with a seriousness that matched the gravity of the situation. Naomi, sitting on one side of the table, placed her black folder neatly in front of her. Across from her sat Richard, his usual smugness replaced with a forced composure. The meeting began with introductions and formalities, but it wasn't long before the conversation shifted to the allegations at hand. Naomi's supervisor, a no-nonsense woman named Linda Harris, took the lead. Her tone was calm but firm, her questions piercing, as she laid out the evidence Naomi had gathered. "Mr. Coleman," Linda began, her sharp eyes fixed on Richard, "we've reviewed multiple complaints about your leadership style. Employees have reported instances of public humiliation, discriminatory comments, and a toxic work environment. Do you have anything to say in your defense?" Richard leaned forward, his hands clasped together as he tried to appear sincere. "I won't deny that I run a tight ship," he said, "but I've always had the company's best interests at heart. If my approach came across as harsh, it was never my intention to harm anyone. I simply expect the best from my team." Linda raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "Interesting," she said, flipping through her notes, "because the accounts we've received suggest a pattern of behavior that goes beyond expecting the best." Naomi remained silent, her expression unreadable as she watched Richard squirm under Linda's scrutiny. She had expected this meeting to be intense, but what happened next took everyone by surprise. The door to the conference room opened, and a man in a tailored grey suit stepped in. His presence was commanding, his expression serious. Naomi immediately recognized him as Charles Whittaker, the company's chief legal officer. His unexpected arrival sent a ripple of unease through the room. "I'm sorry to interrupt," Charles said, his deep voice filling the space. "But there's been a new development." He placed a stack of documents on the table and slid them toward Linda, who began reading through them with a furrowed brow. Naomi exchanged a glance with her supervisor, sensing that whatever this was, it wasn't part of the original plan. "Mr. Whittaker," Linda said after a moment, "would you care to elaborate?" Charles nodded, his gaze shifting to Richard. "It seems Mr. Coleman has been involved in activities that go beyond workplace misconduct. These documents outline evidence of financial improprieties, including the misuse of company funds and falsified expense reports." The room fell into stunned silence. Even Naomi, who had meticulously prepared for this meeting, hadn't anticipated this revelation. Richard's face went pale, his confident facade crumbling in real time. "This is ridiculous," Richard sputtered, his voice shaking. "I've done no such thing. This is some kind of setup." Charles remained unfazed, his tone cool and professional. "The evidence is quite clear, Mr. Coleman. These transactions were flagged during a routine audit, and further investigation revealed a direct connection to your accounts. If you have an explanation, now would be the time to provide it." Naomi watched as Richard struggled to form a coherent response. This wasn't just about his treatment of employees anymore. The stakes had escalated, and the walls were closing in on him faster than he could react. Linda leaned back in her chair, her expression stern. "Given this new information, we'll need to expand the scope of this investigation. Ms. Bennett," she said, turning to Naomi, "thank you for your diligence in bringing these issues to light. Your work has been instrumental in uncovering a much larger problem." Naomi nodded, her calm demeanor unchanged, though inside she felt a mix of vindication and shock. She had always suspected there was more to Richard's behavior than met the eye, but she hadn't expected it to unravel this quickly. As the meeting adjourned, Richard stormed out of the room, his face a mask of anger and desperation. Naomi stayed behind, speaking briefly with Linda and Charles about the next steps. As she gathered her belongings and walked back to her desk, she couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. Despite everything that had come to light, Naomi knew Richard wouldn't go down without a fight. He was the kind of person who thrived on control, and losing it would only make him more dangerous. The battle was far from over, and the tension in the office was palpable as everyone awaited the fallout. Later that afternoon, Naomi received an email from Linda outlining the expanded investigation and requesting additional documentation. As she read through the email, a phone buzzed with a text message. It was from an unknown number, but the message was chillingly clear. "You've made a big mistake. Watch your back." Naomi's breath caught in her throat. She looked around the office, her mind racing. Had Richard sent the message? Or was someone else involved in his schemes? The conflict that had started as a fight for workplace justice had spiraled into something much darker, and Naomi knew she had to stay vigilant. The stakes had never been higher, and the truth was more complex than anyone had imagined. Naomi sat in her car in the dimly lit parking garage, the anonymous texts still fresh in her mind. She debated calling the police, but hesitated. She couldn't afford to panic, not now. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about exposing a man who had abused his power for far too long. She double-checked her locks, started the car, and drove home, determined to see this through. The following morning, Naomi arrived at work earlier than usual, the office eerily quiet. She carried a small USB drive in her pocket. Its contents, the culmination of weeks of meticulous documentation. This wasn't just about Richard's workplace misconduct or even the financial discrepancies. This was about ensuring no one else would ever suffer under his leadership again. By mid-morning, whispers spread like wildfire through the office. Richard had been summoned to another meeting with senior management, this time behind closed doors. Naomi stayed at her desk, her heart pounding as she awaited the outcome. An hour later, the door opened, and Richard emerged, his face a mix of anger and panic. He avoided everyone's gaze as he marched to his office, slamming the door behind him. Moments later, Linda appeared, walking directly to Naomi's desk. "Can I have a moment, Naomi?" she asked, her tone softer than usual. Naomi nodded, standing to follow her into the conference room. Inside, Linda closed the door and turned to Naomi. "You've done incredible work," she said. "The evidence you provided has been crucial, not just for our internal investigation, but for a case we're now building with external authorities. Richard Coleman has officially been placed on administrative leave." Naomi felt a wave of relief wash over her, but Linda wasn't finished. "However," she continued, her expression darkening, "there's something you need to know. During the investigation, we discovered that Richard wasn't acting alone. There's evidence suggesting that someone else in this office has been helping him cover his tracks." Naomi's relief turned to dread. "Do you know who?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Linda nodded. "We're still piecing it together, but we suspect one of the senior team leads. Until we have confirmation, I need you to stay alert and keep everything you know confidential. This isn't over yet." Naomi agreed, though her mind raced with questions. Who could it be? And why? The day dragged on, the tension in the office thick enough to cut with a knife. Naomi kept her head down, her instincts telling her to stay cautious. By late afternoon, she received an email from Charles Whittaker requesting her presence in a high-level meeting scheduled for the next morning. The email was vague, but the urgency was clear. The next day, Naomi entered the boardroom, where senior executives, including Charles and Linda, sat waiting. To her surprise, Richard was there too, seated at the far end of the table, flanked by two lawyers. His expression was defiant, though the cracks in his confidence were beginning to show. Charles began the meeting by addressing the room. "Thank you all for coming. As you're aware, we've uncovered significant misconduct within this office. Today, we're here to finalize the next steps." He turned to Richard. "Mr. Coleman, you have an opportunity to provide a statement before we proceed." Richard leaned forward, his voice laced with indignation. "This entire situation is a farce," he said. "I've dedicated years to this company, and this is how I'm repaid. These accusations are baseless, and I won't stand for it." Charles remained unfazed. Your financial records and employee testimonies tell a different story, he replied. But if you'd like to provide evidence to the contrary, now is the time. Richard's bravado faltered. For the first time, he seemed to realize that his words carried little weight against the mountain of evidence. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, glancing toward his lawyers for support. Then Naomi spoke up. There's something else, she said, her voice steady. All eyes turned to her as she placed the USB drive on the table. This contains additional proof of Mr. Coleman's actions, including emails and correspondence that point to his accomplice. Richard's face went pale. You have no idea what you're talking about, he snapped, but the panic in his voice betrayed him. Charles inserted the USB into his laptop and began scrolling through the files. The room was silent as he read, his expression growing grimmer with each passing second. Finally, he looked up, his gaze fixed on Richard. Mr. Coleman, he said, the evidence is overwhelming. Not only have you engaged in workplace harassment and financial misconduct, but it appears you've been funneling company resources to a third party, someone within this very office. The room erupted into murmurs, but Charles silenced them with a raised hand. Naomi, he continued, would you care to explain what you found? Naomi took a deep breath. During my investigation, I noticed patterns in certain financial reports that didn't add up. After digging deeper, I discovered email exchanges between Richard and another employee, detailing how they manipulated budgets and forged signatures to cover their tracks. Richard's composure shattered. You're lying? He shouted, but the evidence was undeniable. Charles clicked on a final file, displaying a series of emails on the large screen. The recipient's name was clear for everyone to see. Karen Thompson, a senior team lead who had been a close ally of Richard's. Gasps filled the room as Karen, sitting quietly at the far end of the table, suddenly stood. This is ridiculous, she said, her voice shaking. I had no idea what Richard was doing. But the evidence told a different story. Emails, signed documents, and even surveillance footage painted a damning picture. Karen had been just as involved as Richard, if not more. Charles leaned back in his chair, his turn final. Both of you will face disciplinary action, and the company will fully cooperate with law enforcement. This behavior is unacceptable, and justice will be served. As security escorted Richard and Karen out of the building, Naomi felt a weight lift off her shoulders. The battle had been long and exhausting, but she had stood her ground. She had exposed the truth and ensured that justice would prevail. As she returned to her desk, Naomi allowed herself a small smile. She had proven that integrity and perseverance could triumph, even in the face of corruption. And though the fight was over, she knew the lessons she had learned would stay with her forever.